This week we'll be looking at managing ownership and permission of files in the Linux operating system. That's one of the most critical aspects of an administrator's job, and we'll spend a decent amount of time looking at the different tools that allow us to do it. And then we'll look at setting quotas, where we can actually restrict users to a certain amount of space on the file system, also another important aspect. The first thing we're going to look at is ownership and how we can change ownership. Now, key point to understand is that every file on a Linux system is owned by two entities. It's owned by the user. So we have a user owner. So if you're logged in as student, for instance, and you create a file, the user student will be the owner of that file. And then you also have a group ownership. So once again, if you're student, you're logged in and you create a file, that file will be owned by student. And the group student will also own it. And that's because on a Red Hat based system, they use something called the user private group scheme, which means that when we create a user, for instance, student, a group is created along with that user, and the only member of that group is the user account itself. So when any time that student or any account on the system, including root, creates a file and folder, by default, that account becomes the owner of that file or folder. Now we can change ownership of files and folders, and we'll see why we want to do that as we go along through the lecture. It becomes really important to change permissions when we create other groups, such as a sales group or an HR group, and have users put into that group, and then give that group permissions to files and folders on the system. There are two commands that we can use to change the ownership of files and folders. There's the change group command, which logically means that we'll be able to change the group owner of that file. And then there's the change owner command, or chown. That allows us to change the owner of a file. Now, typically, I'll use chown alone because chown will allow you to do both. So with the chown command, we can change the user and the group owner. We just have to specify and be accurate about which one we want to change. Typically, I'll use that command to change the ownership of and the group ownership of a file or folder. So let's now go to the command line and take a look at changing ownership using both of those commands. For this lecture, I've created a couple of different accounts on the system. And as you probably remember from previous accounts, we can see our group membership by typing the ID command. So if I type ID, I can see the membership of root. Now, I can also, as root, see the group membership of any user. So I can, if I wanted to, I could say ID Joe, account I've created. And you'll notice that right here, it specifies that Joe is a member of two groups. He's a member of the Joe group and sales. By default, a user will only be initially a member of their own group. So if I ID Pam, we can see that this is typical way it would be set up. We have the user ID Pam, and remember the number is what is significant to the system. Then we have the group ID and what groups Pam is a member of. Now this is the primary group. So this is Pam's primary group, and by default, typically a user will be put into their own primary group on a Red Hat based system. And that's where you will leave them unless some unusual circumstance comes along. Because as you can see with Joe, Joe is a primary group is the Joe group. We can also have him member of other groups if we need to. If I want to, I can change the group ownership of a file or folder with the two commands, and let's go look at that. So what I'll do is clear my screen here, and I'll VI a file, and I'll save it, and then I'll do an LL on that file. Let me clear the screen so we don't have so much clutter going on here. And as you can see, there are, by default, this is the user owner of that file, and this is the group owner of that file. Now, let's say I wanted to share that file with somebody else, and I'm going to just give you a little preview of another command we'll be using a little bit later on, the change mod command. I'm going to actually change the permissions on that for a second, so I will say 444.0 root file. All right. So I haven't changed the ownership, I just changed the permissions just for demonstration purposes, because what I'm going to do is share that file with another user. And you can see what happens when we do that. So I'll share this file with Pam. So I'll just say copy. And I'll put it in Pam's folder, and then I'll Shift-Control-T, open up another terminal, and I'll SU in as Pam. And then I'll do an LL. Oh, I'm in my desktop folder, that's why. And there's root's file that was shared with Pam. Now you can see, even though I'm in the Pam directory right now, when I copy the file over, it copied over and retained the ownership of that file. So this is a problem, because if Pam goes to cat that file, even though I've given it to her, she can't see the contents. And so we need to be able to change the ownership. Now, changing ownership is a root privilege. It is not something a normal user can do, and you'll see why that is later on when we talk about quotas on the system. So Pam can't actually run the change ownership command here. I'll have to switch back over to root, and what I'll do is I'll cd into Pam's directory. And I'll do an LL here, and then I'll run the change group command. And I will change the group to Pam on the root file. And as you can see, that changed the group ownership of that file to the Pam group. And now we should be able to switch over back to Pam. And where we had a permission deny before, we'll cat that file again. And sure enough, now I can read the file because the group ownership has been changed. I can also use the chown command to accomplish the same thing. So I can use the chown command, like to chown root file. Oops, got to put something in here. And I can change the ownership, the user owner, over to Pam. Now I can do both. I can change the group and the user with the chown command. All I have to do is put a colon in between or after the user, and then I can specify change. First change the user, and then change the group. If I don't put anything and just a colon, that would be the same as running this command up here, because the colon represents anything to the right of the colon represents the group, and by specifying a colon and then a name, it understands, the chown command understands that I want to change the group ownership of that file. So I'll go back, and what I'll do is I'll put Pam as the user owner, and once again, this is just for demonstration purposes, and I'll say that root is the group owner of the file. Go back over here. Well, we can do it right from here. We'll just do an LL here, and sure enough, now I've changed the group ownership back to root, and Pam is the user owner. She can still read it because of her permissions, when you'll learn about permissions in a few minutes. So Pam can still read the file because she still is an owner of the file. So I'll cat the file again. And sure enough, she can. Now this really comes into play when we're dealing with ownership, group ownership of, let's say, a sales folder or an HR folder. When Pam is a member of that group, and I don't think Pam's a member of any group right now. No, she isn't. When Pam is a member of a group that saves a file to a folder we want to make sure that the ownership of that file changes to the group that owns the particular folder, and I'll demonstrate that for you in our next video.